4 years ago, New Zealand was in a state of shock as we mourned the loss of 257 people in the Erebus disaster. But over that 4 years, the story of the crash and its causes has bit by bit been put together by inquiries and commissions and appeals. But I think it's fair to say that we might never have known why the crash occurred if it hadn't been for the efforts of our next guest. He's a very experienced DC-10 captain who's received awards for outstanding air navigation and the highest standards of compassion and judgment and airmanship. Throughout the Erebus hearings, he refused to accept some of the shallow and expert guesses about weather conditions in Antarctica and the actions of the aircrew aboard flight TE-901. He kept on asking questions, and he read, and he researched, and he pushed until he found the answers. Captain Gordon Betty. Gordon, when, as we began to tease at the awful bits of evidence that there were about Erebus, when did you realize that you, Gordon Betty, had to do something about this?
Well, it was really pretty early on, I guess. It was actually on the flight where the accident occurred. I realized that if Jim Collins, a captain who I'd known for more than 20-odd years, an exceptional pilot in all respects, could have been the victim of this terrible crash, then I rationalized that so could I, and so could any of the rest of us. So it was a matter of trying to determine the true cause of this accident.
What was this Gordon Betty saying that this can't be right? You know, what has been advanced so far? Was it just a niggle? Was it no more than that?
Well, it was a very definite compulsion to, or even revulsion, really, at the philosophy that was being espoused by the company and the department, that a captain of Collins's caliber would take a crew and passengers screaming and kicking down through cloud till they smashed into the side of the mountain. That just wasn't on.
You see, because what the early things said was that the cause was known and it was pilot error. What did that do to you?
Well, that did two things. First of all, it spurred me on to greater efforts to try and research the visual perceptual side of the accident, and I realised that my views and those of Mr. Chippendale were starting to diverge quite markedly, in that he appeared to be paying pretty scant attention to the human factors or ergonomics, and in particular the visual aspects. So I went to varsity. My two sons, both science graduates, put me onto a reading list, and so did the various universities around the world, and in a process of sort of working backwards from the accident site, I arrived at a hypothesis on how the accident may have happened.
Human perceptual psychology became the enigmatic element in this study. To understand the interface between pilot, machine, and environment, Captain Vetty began his investigations at Auckland University's psychology department, where his studies were encouraged and directed by Dr. Barry Kirkwood.
So if we put the sun in here then, Barry, what would be?
Captain Vetty's findings from his study of the mechanics of sight and of psychological sets is demonstrated here. You'll see a dramatic example of the accepted medical thesis that man, whose actions are 80% controlled by sight, always functions through a combination of the eyes and the brain.
With the human eye, believing is seeing. With the camera, seeing is believing. Let's consider this cross-section of the human eye as being a camera, with the lens here and a film placed at the back. Light rays from the object would pass through the lens, crossing over, and form a distinct but inverted image at the back. Clearly, in this case, seeing would be believing. Let's move inside this camera now with its clear image and reconstruct it as the human eye. First of all, in front of the lens we have the cornea, which we know is less than perfectly transparent. The fluid or vitreous humour through which the light rays travel is also less than transparent. and therefore the light rays impinging on the back of the eye are degraded or attenuated. In this process of passing through and penetrating quite deeply into the tissue, they have to pass through the neural wiring for the eye, which is on the side from which the light rays are travelling, and other impediment before they finally impinge on the photic cells on the retina of the eye. The neural wiring, which partially blocks the photic cells, distorts the image like a picket fence lying in front of the retina. This further distorts and degrades the original image. As you can see, the image is broken and seriously distorted in the passage of light rays reaching the photic receptors. Now we have to say to ourselves, how do we repair this image and restore it to its original value? To do this, we obviously have to do it with the processes in the higher levels of the brain, which take into account what their expectation of that object really is. It is critically important to understand the final perceptual experience initiated by the stimulus is determined by a complex interplay of processes at the various levels of the peripheral and central nervous systems. The human eye selects out this very narrow band of frequency from within the vast electromagnetic band in picking out the area of visual light rays. At the most fundamental level, stimulus energy at the retina is transduced, that is, changed from light energy to electrical impulses in the neural fibers. Encoding the information in the stimulus array, that is, color, size, movement, and shape, is preserved in the pattern of impulses transmitted to the visual areas of the cortex of the brain. At a higher level, the incoming information is decoded and interpreted as a meaningful representation of external events. Interpretation involves those higher mental processes collectively called cognition. In particular, it involves memory and mental set. Perception is a highly synthetic process. Therefore, what we see is far from the exact image of the physical world. Perception is highly variable and often erroneous. We can only perceive what we can conceive.
For the same reason you were trapped into believing these cards were the same size, the crew of 901 were trapped into believing the cliffs of Lewis Bay were the cliffs of McMurdo Sound. This was caused in both cases by the lack of intermediate visual texture. The larger card represents Cape Bernacchi, the smaller card Cape Bird. Both objects subtend the same retinal angle, presenting an identical image. This deception, occurring at the retina, was passed to the higher processes of the brain and would have served to reinforce all the other expectations or mental sets. Right up until impact, the crew were reassured by seeing precisely what they expected to see.